video, I'm going to show you how to make an NMR sample. Before you start making your NMR sample, it's good to have everything you need to hand. So here I have my compound of interest, some deuterated NMR solvent, an NMR tube, an NMR lid, some pipettes, and some cotton wool for filtering. NMR is quite an insensitive technique, so we need to have quite a large amount of sample, a couple of MIGs for a proton NMR, and maybe about 20 MIGs for a carbon NMR. First thing we need to do is dissolve up our sample. I'm using deuterated chloroform, and you need to use about 0.7 ml of solvent. This should give you about 4 centimeters of depth in your NMR tube. Make sure your sample is mixed. In order to filter your sample, you need to pop a small amount of cotton wool into a short pipette. It's useful to use a long pipette to pop the cotton wool to the bottom. You can then put this filter at the top of our NMR tube and add our dissolved sample. In the instance that you don't have enough solvent, be sure to use a fresh pipette to add more. You should have your 4 centimeters depth in your NMR tube, and we can put the lid on. Lots of other people will also be running NMR samples, so it's important to label your sample tube carefully. Next, we go to the NMR machine. So, I've arrived in the NMR lab. I'm going to put my sample on the 400 megahertz NMR spectrometer that you can see here. Because I added some extra solvent to my sample earlier, I'm just going to make sure it's thoroughly mixed. When you arrive at the NMR machine, you need to pop your sample into a sample holder and use the depth gauge to make sure that the sample goes the appropriate depth into the probe. I'm going to give the sample a wipe with a tissue on the outside to remove any contamination that would otherwise get into the NMR probe. And in order to lower our sample carefully into the NMR machine without breaking it, turning on a supply of compressed air such that the NMR sample hovers on the bed of air. Once the sample's hovering, we can turn off the air supply and it will be lowered slowly into the centre of the magnet. Alternatively, if you're short of time, you can use one of the automation machines. In this case, the robot arm will pick up the sample for you. All you need to do is once again tell it which experiments you'd like to run and which solvent you're using. Once our sample is in the NMR spectrometer, we can give the spectrometer some information about the sample that we want to run. Just need to tell it that we're using deuterated chloroform as our solvent and that we want to run a proton, otherwise known as hydrogen, NMR experiment. Then we can start acquiring our data, and a few moments later we can then process the data to turn it into a spectrum, as you can see on the screen.